Should we get started now, or are we still waiting?
I think this
Okay.
is good. I think this is a good time to start.
Okay, so we are one of the three groups for the COVID-19 and the economy. We'll be talking about the impact on small business and big businesses, unemployment and working from home. And then just to give everybody an idea of what topics are going to be covered by other groups, so there's no confusion, other groups will cover inflation, GDP, stock market, price stability, wealth distribution, and demographics. You want to move? Yeah, there we go. So we're going to be talking about first the business impacts from COVID-19, especially or specifically on small versus large companies. And so you can go to the next slide here, Eddie. So what is important to understand before we kind of go into the impacts is that there were a number of tailwinds to small and big businesses that were occurring even without COVID. And the reason that this is important to understand is because while COVID did have some unforeseen changes, it also accelerated certain changes that were already taking place. So some of these kind of tailwinds that were existing were large businesses have been stealing market share from small businesses. And a lot of this is driven by a period of consolidation from leading corporations, which have been in recent years forming what's considered mega corporations. And so some statistics that kind of back this up is that in the 1980s, half of retail shopping took place in independent stores. But when you look at the numbers today, it's actually less than a fourth of all of retail shopping is happening in independent stores. And then between 2002 and 2017, Home Depot and Lowe's almost doubled their share of home improvement retail market. So this is just this continuing trend of stealing market share from these small local companies. And so their market share improved from 42% all the way to 81%. And so then before COVID, there were 43 metropolitan areas where over half of all groceries were being bought at Walmart alone. And so this is just this continuing idea that these large corporations are consolidating and taking over the vast majority of the market share. And then one final trend that was occurring was this increasing demand for online shopping. And so now to kind of look at the specific impacts on small businesses. So some of these trends, such as the market share being stolen by small businesses, that is a trend that was accelerated by COVID-19. And so this can be seen by the fact that the small businesses that were unable to survive or are struggling to survive during COVID are those who lacked the capital and the cash to outlast the pandemic. Because as we know, during the pandemic, only the essential companies, essential workers were still working. And so many of these small businesses, like restaurants, were forced to just wait out the pandemic. And so one idea that is important to understand is that not only are these smaller businesses dying out because they're losing customers, but those customers are then being claimed by the quote winners of the pandemic, which is only furthering consolidation and furthering this trend that bigger companies are taking all of smaller companies' customers. And then just to kind of better define what we would consider a winner of the pandemic, where one is a company who had the cash to simply wait for customers to return, but two, also those who had the technology to survive. And so this is something I'll talk a little bit more about with the big businesses, but technology was really important as we saw in COVID-19 as there became a shift towards online ordering, curbside pickup, different things like that required a strong technological basis. And then some kind of statistics that just back up this trend that we've seen in small businesses. The number of people that were working as business owners fell by more than 20% between February and April. And then secondly, there was a Yelp report that reported that over 140,000 businesses on their site closed between March 1st and June 15th. Obviously not all of those were permanent, but 40 of those were permanent, which is a pretty significant amount. And it just furthers this idea that small businesses were closing while bigger businesses were taking their customers. So now the impacts on the large businesses. for a very solid amount of large businesses, COVID-19 actually helped to a certain extent, because as we saw, COVID-19 forced customers to go online for their shopping, with the companies who were able to stay afloat. And given that these larger corporations such as Amazon, Apple, Target, Best Buy, those were all companies that were able to stay afloat and had the technological um, abilities, they ended up being large winners of this pandemic. So if you look at this kind of statistic here, shoppers during April and May spent 50% more time than they usually do shopping online. And so as a result, Walmart, Target, and Best Buy all doubled or nearly doubled their internet sales. And then obviously for very evident reasons, Amazon benefited the most. And then to kind of continue talking about the impacts on larger businesses, on the next slide here. So one of the larger businesses is the entertainment section, which prior to COVID was already a very concentrated area, especially as there's been a shift from movie theaters and stadiums to video streams. But with that said, the main entertainment streamers were just a handful of tech companies who own their own streaming services, and they monopolized the internet service providers. So consumption of streaming entertainment increased by 81%, with the profit going just to those handful of tech companies. So there's this idea again that this consolidation at the top of the most wealthy companies that was only accelerated by COVID. But it is important to note, though, that not every large company was a winner. However, you can make the argument that they were not as much of a loser as the smaller companies. And the reason of this is that there were many large corporations who have survived or thrived in the last few years solely on the basis of having very strong brand names or brand reputation, but that they weren't necessarily having the strongest balance sheets or technology to back up their business. And so these would be some of the larger companies that were unable to survive the pandemic. However, the reason I say that they are not as much of a loser as the small businesses is the fact that given that they had these large brand names and reputations, it was an asset that even larger corporations saw to buy out these companies. And so many of those companies didn't actually die out from the pandemic, but rather were bought up by a larger corporation. And then secondly, there have been a number of private equity firms who have been looking at these companies who have been buying them out at a bargained price, and then reviving the company. And then moving forward. So it's important to also look at what the future impact will be on business, because obviously we're still experiencing COVID-19 and there's really no way to fully know what the future will look like. But for now, we've understood this new idea of a new normal, which is including social distancing, masks, sanitizing, and limited retail and restaurant capacity. And so we can only imagine that for however long this new normal exists, if not forever, that technology will have a growing importance. And so, as we've already seen, many companies need to be looking for ways to develop processes for managing their traffic flow and minimizing the amount of human interaction that's happening in their actual stores. And you can see this through contactless or self-checkout, curbside pickup, online ordering, and a number of other technologies that have existed. And it's important to understand that this is actually an added barrier to entry for consumer goods stores, because there's this larger amount of investments into technology that are going to be needed, which unfortunately most mom and pop businesses can't afford. It obviously is already enough of an investment to start your own company. And the simple notion that there's now increased investments to make at the beginning is only going to make it harder for mom and pop businesses to be created, and will continue this idea of consolidation from larger companies. And then there's one aspect that is very uncertain, which is the future outlook on retail, travel, healthcare, and real estate. And so travel and healthcare is, for very obvious reasons why those are uncertain. But retail and real estate, we'll dive a little bit deeper into on a few later slides. So now we'll be heading towards unemployment, I believe. Oh, sorry. One last thing is the entertainment section. So I know we discussed this a little bit before, but essentially this shift is being seen by not only the fact that there was a previous shift into this industry, but also that movie distribution was already highly concentrated on those handful of companies as listed here. And then as noted before, that there was the increase in consumption of streaming entertainment by 81%.
Yeah, so now moving into unemployment. You can go to the next slide. So just first off, how COVID relates to unemployment. COVID has triggered a severe economic recession and unprecedented rates of unemployment all over many countries, which just a few we'll touch on today. But it's also important to note that decades of evidence have also shown there's a strong association between unemployment and adverse health outcomes, which just further augments the severe symptoms of COVID-19 already. Next slide. So this graph shows the unemployment rates in Canada, Australia, and the United States. It also shows Australia adjusted to account for their temporarily laid off or stood down employees. At the peak time of COVID cases across the world, well, the first peak, I guess, unemployment rates were also at its peak. In April, the United States had an unemployment rate of approximately 15%, and Australia 12% with the adjusted rate. Canada had yet to peak, but it was at 13% then, and then in May, peaking at approximately 14%. And since April, unemployment rates have begun to make their way back down closer to where they were pre-COVID, but not necessarily to what they were at. Next slide. So now focusing in a little bit more on Europe, this first figure one on the left shows the unemployment rates for the European Union, the blue line, and then the EEA, which is just the European Union plus a few more countries in yellow. This shows the unemployment rates over many years, but it's important to note that as COVID-19 ramped up in Q2 of 2020, so did the unemployment rates, and they continue to climb throughout Q3, getting up to about 7.5 in the EU and 8% in the EEA. Then the graph on the right explores unemployment rates in just specifically the European Union and looks at different subgroups. This was just a little part we just wanted to touch on. Young people saw the most high unemployment rates in the European Union at about 17%, whereas those above 25, which was considered not young, saw unemployment rates of just over 6%. Then looking specifically at women versus men, women had higher unemployment rates of 8% and men 7%, which was not a steep difference as young and old. Next slide. Now focusing more on the US. So this graph here just basically blew up what was on the first graph showing the various countries. So as you can see, same thing, unemployment grew exponentially along with the amount of cases of COVID-19 in the US, peaking in April, but since then has looked like it's been on a steady decline in this graph, again, not returning to pre-COVID-19 rates. Next slide. So now focusing more on by states, this graph just shows each state is a circle, and then the larger the circle, the higher percent of unemployment in the state, and the grid represents the change in unemployment rates. So you can see that the biggest change in the amount of unemployment was Hawaii, Nevada, and California. These three same states also had the highest unemployment rate. Then next slide. This graph focuses more on the relationship between unemployment insurance claims and the labor force. So specifically people having to put in claims for being laid off or temporarily stood down. You can see here that the 5 highest percentage, like the best states were Hawaii, Michigan, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, Nevada. Then the 5 lowest who were doing the best, Connecticut, Florida, West Virginia, Colorado, South Dakota. Hawaii had a 16% ratio and South Dakota had a 4%.
Hi. In terms of the question in the chat, Chris, we'll touch on that a little bit in the working from home section. Um, the CARES Act, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, was signed by Trump in March of 2020. It included $2 trillion in cash towards targeted businesses, individuals, and impacted industries. A small business, as defined by the SBA, is a business with less than 500 employees, although there are some industry-specific cases where it's more. There were stimulus checks, as I'm sure you're aware, that were approximately $1,200 per person. These fiscal impact payments came out approximately 2 weeks after being signed and saw an increase in spending on necessary goods in the immediate aftermath as a sign of a successful intervention. The Paycheck Protection Program was probably the biggest part of it, and it was with the goal to keep hiring. So there were provided $349 billion between February and June, again towards small businesses specifically, and this was about keeping payroll expenses going towards employees. Other areas included interest payments on mortgages, covering rent obligations, and covering utility payments. Some specifics of it were that they were only reimbursed as it did not exceed principal, so only going to the principal amount, and then additionally, it was only applicable during the first 8 weeks after the loan's inception when it was signed. Some important takeaways from this is that while the whole focus of this policy was focused on minimizing unemployment due to the lockdown and not having the businesses burden this cost, as the government would take it, there could be a potential increase in inflation down the line.
So now looking towards the future in the U.S., many bills have been proposed, but two specifically, the GOP skinny bill. The Senate Democrats on Wednesday actually blocked it, but it was going to be a $500 billion plan that expanded unemployment benefits, funding for schools, and a second round of PPP. However, it did not include a second round of stimulus checks for individuals, which many Americans were hoping for. Then the other proposed act was the HEROES Act, which was a $2.2 trillion bill, which included a second stimulus check, but this has little chance of passing Senate as many predominantly Republicans are opposed to any bill exceeding a total of $1 trillion. So conversations will still continue, but it doesn't look like anything is going to pass before the upcoming election.
So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the government intervention in Europe in terms of unemployment and helping out their citizens there. So on March 18th, the European Central Bank released a 750 billion euro pandemic emergency purchase program, which was then upgraded to the 1.35 trillion euro 2.5 months later. Then subsequently, around the same time, the European Commission, European Investment Bank, and the European Stability Mechanism financed 450 billion euros for people, businesses, and countries. This also included funding for vaccine development and research, financing for employment, and direct and indirect healthcare costs. After the pandemic had progressed further and took a greater economic toll in Europe than originally expected, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel and French President Emmanuel Macron proposed the European fiscal response on July 21st of 2020. And this was a 500 billion euro plan that was then upgraded to 750 billion euros. And this consisted of 390 billion euros in grants and 360 billion euros in loans. And then next slide. Okay, and then Europe is often looked to as the model for how they responded economically. So the European Commission will issue more common debt on the capital markets, which could bring the European safe asset towards 2 billion euros. It's a step towards a stronger European common fiscal response in this time of crisis, which strengthens the position of Europe globally. It also shows European solidarity as money would flow from wealthier countries to the hardest hit and lower income countries. So how Europe proceeded with the COVID-19 crisis, at least economically, should be seen as the model case for the rest of the world, as I said previously. And in the COVID-19 crisis, Europe might be a model in the way it's protected citizens, businesses, member countries, while at the same time showing global leadership in the best interest of humanity.
All right, so now we're going to tackle the work from home question, and there's a lot of different angles that we want to take and we want to consider all different points. So who can work from home? How has their quality of life changed after COVID? Has their productivity been hindered? What are some long-term effects? Are all questions that we want to consider, and some implications of working from home are real estate and commuting implications that come as a result of less people having to commute to the office and having to come and congregate to one place. The benefits of remote work opportunities and the flexibility that comes from working from home, be that childcare or more flexible schedule, working around when you're productive and not when I guess society deems that you're productive from 9 to 5 is like what we consider a typical workday. And are there any silver linings to working from home? So let's tackle the first question is who can work from home? There's a lot of factors, like predominantly what you do for a living that kind of dictates whether or not you can work from home. So if you typically work in something like finance or professional or technology services, you probably don't have much of a transition where you just take your laptop from your office to your house, and you might not have all the amenities that you have in your office, like work collaboration spaces or fancy meeting rooms, but you still have everything in your house. But working in places like tourism or food services or education even would not be as easy when you're working from home, maybe even impossible. So that's why we see countries like, or cities like more that are focused on tourism, like places like Hawaii and like tourist destinations that are hardest hit by COVID because nobody's traveling there anymore, and all those jobs are lost. So that's why we can see leisure and hospitality are the least flexible in this scenario, and this provides a fertile breeding ground for inequity amongst less skilled labor jobs. So in real estate, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, so as you said, we could think of the real estate cost as a sign of where people are choosing to work from home and what benefits the cities really have. It's possible that the really only big benefit of large cities is that they have large offices there and that there's an obligation to be in the office for work. It's a little bit of a pessimistic interpretation, but it follows the data. Additionally, also how coastal megacities and middle market cities in landlocked areas have been hit differently are two areas I'm going to touch on. The yearly growth in rental payments on a compounding basis dropped from 3.8% in February to 0.7% in August. This is a sign of decreasing need for rental payments, and one source of this would be cutting costs for people, especially youth who want to live with their family. And especially in cities, just like the job market outlook for recent graduates who might think about like looking for a job in a more rural place. The other major shifts in consumer demand for housing would be the remote workforce and then also escaping the risks of the pandemic in the city from a health perspective. As you can see in figure 1, there kind of seems to be a difference in how rental payments have gone up in sort of middle market landlocked cities such as Memphis, Phoenix, Indianapolis, and Columbus, while rents seem to precipitously fall in New York City, San Fran, Boston, Washington, D.C. When we think about rental payments, there is an incentive for landlords to keep payments through concessions. So you instead of renting, you're renting apartments rather than owning the apartments, and therefore there's a possibility to cancel your lease. And they've been trying to keep revenue coming through while also trying to provide liquidity for the attendee.
So we're on to the next slide.
Yeah, so effects on employees. The pandemic has affected employees in various ways in terms of working from home. So a major statistic that we found was that 50% of the US labor force would continue to work remotely and actually prefer it if they had the choice. And this was according to Nicholas Bloom, an economist at Stanford University. So this would indicate that employees are generally happier. There are limitations to this study, however, because it was conducted in early July, meaning that employees had most likely only been working from home for about 3 to 4 months maximum, and now it would be about month 8. So their opinions could definitely have changed over this period because now it's more permanent and employees have been working from home for a longer period of time. Also, the general satisfaction of working from home could also depend on the type of work that is being conducted, which wasn't indicated in this study. And then another effect on employees in terms of working from home, as Eddie indicated earlier, that I'm just going to kind of reiterate, is that it could perpetuate economic inequalities among the employees. So those who are in higher earning jobs are more likely to be able to make the shift to remote and working from home than, say, retail workers who experience store shutdowns and can't go into the office. So the higher earning workers are more likely to be able to keep earning, while those who may earn lower incomes are furloughed and unable to keep working, which perpetuates the income divide. And then this graph on the right was from the Gallup panel in March 16th to March 20th, and it was about 8,500 randomly selected adults surveyed over the phone. It was early on during the pandemic, so more jobs are likely to have gone fully remote than the graph portrays. It also doesn't account for workers in essential businesses that are still commuting to work. It only shows those who work from home and who are unable to conduct their work from home. But overall, it gives a good sense that generally as income is increasing, the ability to work from home of the employee is also increasing. And then moving on to another effect on employees is privacy concerns from laptop monitoring. So a lot of employers have software to track what their employees are doing on their laptops, which obviously raise privacy concerns. The employers want to monitor the productivity of their employees, but this can be dangerous and invasive, and some employees are concerned about it. In general, it has been shown that remote work has increased productivity. In 2012, there was a study by the US Patent and Trademark Office, which began a program allowing patent examiners to live anywhere and choose to work remotely. And for those who did choose to work remotely, productivity rose by 4.4%. This was a study outside of COVID. And during the COVID pandemic, there could also be an increase in stress and a sense of isolation from quarantining and health concerns. But overall, working from home has shown a general increase in productivity among employees even during these times. And if working from home were to continue after the pandemic, this could also hold true. However, despite this, there is also a stifling of creativity and team cohesion from working from home and having to work remotely, which relates to a decline in collaboration and team building. Having to work remotely, their Wi-Fi could cut out on Zoom, and remote meetings, people are talking over each other, which makes it harder to come together as in groups and come up with ideas in this way. So in the end, something that really matters is what the company values, and this really depends on what type of work that's being conducted. So if it's a business in which meetings and collaboration are essential, the loss from not having those in-person meetings is greater than, say, a business that values individual productivity more. And it also ultimately really depends on the individual employee as well. So some could be intrinsically motivated to do work from home and they have the right conditions to operate under. They might have a better location and family situation in order to be more productive from working from home, whereas other people may find it more difficult to separate work and personal life, and they may work better when others are around them to constantly motivate them. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the effects on employers. So there are less office costs if there are less employees coming to the office on a daily basis. So major things like furniture, repairs, and real estate costs can also be lower if a company decides to downsize office space due to less employees coming into the office. Um, Another benefit that can accrue to the employers is that they can hire talented employees regardless of their location when most of their employee base is working from home. So in this way, they have more options. There's no need to come into the office for the employees, so they can essentially hire anyone who has the credentials that they're looking for. Also, there's a reduction in the carbon footprint of the firm due to lower emissions from commuting among their employees, and that could make the firm more attractive to environmentally conscious consumers. Another effect on employers, a negative effect, is that there is a diminishing company culture. Um, their teams become disjointed because, as I was saying previously, there's no opportunities for team building or collaboration activities, which provides for a lower sense of engagement among their employees. And this could also foster a lack of loyalty to companies, and enthusiasm about the future of the company is less likely among the employees, which could be detrimental to their success. Also, another negative effect is delayed responses for questions. So if an employer has a question to their employee, it may be harder to reach them. If it's a time-sensitive matter, this could also raise concerns. And then the last thing is the long-term and post-COVID implications from working from home. It has been shown that working from home could last well into the future, so there could be a permanence in this. The chart shown to the right is from Switzerland, and it shows the percentage of Swiss workers working from home before the pandemic, and then during the pandemic, which showed 50% working from home. And then the last data point there is when the Swiss numbers of COVID deaths were significantly low. At some points, they even had 0 cases in a day. So there was a large relief of a return to normalcy in that sense. And it's interesting to see how more people began to return to the office, but not back to the original levels of people who were working in the office. Obviously, this graph has flaws and limitations in that it hadn't been long enough after the pandemic was supposedly over in Switzerland to accurately measure these things. So many companies may have wanted to protect the safety of their employees by not sending them back right away, which proved to probably be the right decision because Switzerland also seemed to spike again in mid to late October. It also shows the percentage of people working from home for at least half a day, which seems to be an insignificant amount, and we can't tell the difference between an employee who works from home all week versus half a day a week. But despite these limitations, it's still interesting to see the potential of working from home may continue into the future, although it's hard to model or predict right now since we're still in the midst of the pandemic. Another long-term implication is the innovation in the online office. So because of the potential to work from home more often, app developers and software designers are trying to provide for a better online office that allows for more features and efficiencies. So we could possibly see an influx of those apps available in the market. Governments can also subsidize technological advancements and internet expansion in order to prepare for future crisis or to help companies ease the transition to working from home more often. And obviously, as I was stating before, with the influx of individuals working from home, there has been and will continue to be a greater threat to the security of information of employees, which leads to an increasing need to develop better cybersecurity standards and safety strategies for the future, which governments could also subsidize. And there is also a shift to the suburbs if remote work does continue, because although remote work may not be done remote full time, it'll still impact where people live because they'll be willing to drive further as a result of going into the office fewer times a week. If workers do return back to the office after working from home, there may be larger office spaces and more social distancing to provide better safety measures after the pandemic.
Cool. So thank you, everyone. We have some questions in the chat. So the first question, we're just gonna take them now. Is unemployment uniform across socioeconomic groups or differentiated? Management versus workers, for example. Based on our figures here, we see that people that are earning more are usually working from home. So they're probably not unemployed, which kind of leads us to believe that if you're in management, it's likely that you're probably not unemployed. So I would conjecture that I guess people that are in management are suffering lower rates of unemployment, but we don't have the numbers on that necessarily.
And just to add on to that, one of our other economic groups is focusing on wealth distribution and demographics, which should include like distribution across different socioeconomic groups. So I would imagine that they would kind of answer your question a little bit more pointed.
Right. And the other question we have here is that housing prices in Williamstown.
Eddie,
oh, yeah.
Before you ask a follow-up.
Uh-huh.
One of the big themes of the class is looking at the right statistic. Do you think the unemployment rate is the right statistic to look at, or are there other statistics that might be more appropriate? You know, what can you define the unemployment rate? What does that measure?
Right. So unemployment from before is like who's in a job or out of a job that like it's either underemployed or not working in that job. So like that doesn't really necessarily measure like the change in pandemics. I think the best thing would be to look at would be either job loss, like the percentage of job loss after March, which is kind of when the pandemic started. So maybe unemployment is not the best number to look at, but I guess it's the most standardized.
Yeah, and one of the slides up there, I focused on, well, that one specifically that's up is the unemployment insurance claims to labor force. So that looks at how many people specifically would have lost their job and are now claiming unemployment. Then also another one of the slides shows the percent change in unemployment rate over the time. So you'll see the difference from before and then after, like due to COVID, what changed.
Can I share a slide?
This one?
No,
right?
Yes.
Can I share a slide from my computer?
Oh yeah, sure.
Okay, so I'm going to just take over for just 1 second. And so here's the definition of unemployment. Unemployment occurs when a person who is actively searching for employment is unable to find work. And so the active is a part of it. And so I'll just move to something else quickly. So here is a plot of unemployment over time. This is the Great Recession, which started 2008. And you can see, 4 years later, October 2012, the unemployment rate is 7.8%. Over here in COVID, spikes up much higher to around 14.7%. But in a much shorter period of time, it's already down to about 7.9%. So in much less time, things are falling down to a similar level. When you look at the labor force participation rate, there's a very interesting trend of this, going down almost uniformly for many, many years until around 2015, 2016. And then again, higher than it was, falling down significantly and not climbing up as much yet. So just, trying to show some other statistics might be worth looking at. And what trends were already happening, how much of what's going on is causing maybe some people to decide to retire early. I know right now with a lot of people who are trying to decide, do they want to go to school this year or do they want to take a year off from school? Same thing with jobs. So my share.
Okay. We have one other question. Housing prices in Williamstown exploded. Great Barrington has turned into the Hamptons. What happens in a year when people wake up from the COVID stupor? I think work from home also has a huge part to do with this. So I think a lot of people are leaving from all these expensive cities like New York City and Boston, which are the most adjacent to Williamstown. And a lot of people that are living in those cities have like a summer home in Williamstown. I know from like being here for a while. So they're kind of moving back and it's cheap property compared to what they're used to. So I think the COVID stupor might not be a stupor in itself. Like I think people might be able to realize that they don't actually have to all congregate into one city, and it might actually be more permanent. Where I guess like I don't know if you've heard of Steve Case and he's talking about the third wave of economic revolution where more of the income is spread around the rest of the country into like suburbs and stuff. I don't want to really get that much into it, but I think a lot of places like Williamstown and more rural regions will see more population in the future because of the work from home and because of the flexibility that it provides. So I don't know if anybody wants to add something to that.
Yeah, I touched on it quickly, but it really just depends on future expectations of whether it will be a permanent change or not. Because I think you were speaking to Chris, to almost like housing prices, which would be more of a short-term impact of like, do you sell or not? But I think if there were any capital expenditure towards like either building new houses or renovating your house to maybe make it more enticing for rentals or something like that, and then the demand for rural or secluded housing went away, there could be an implication that there would be foreclosures in like Berkshires and other rural counties across the United States.
Right. We have time for probably 2 more questions. So would you want to work from home if it means your kids have to be schooled from home? From Stephen Miller. Does anybody in the group want to take that question?
The reason I asked this is you were presenting the data of a lot of people would like to work from home if that's an option. And I wonder
Right.
how those numbers would change if you threw into that, you can work from home, but your kids are going to be home with you. The kids that we love, that we love spending time with.
Yeah, some concerns, having trouble focusing and concentrating on work has been a very valid concern. I think having to raise kids while having to work is not something that's super manageable for a lot of people. They have to get creative with how, this is my workspace, this is the times that I'm going to be working. Scheduling is difficult, homeschooling is difficult. So that might be, the numbers for work from home might be a little different if you had that factored into the question.
Yeah, I think also the age of your children would matter, with more dependency for younger children, and then also what job you have and what job your partner has as well. Because I think if there's like a time sensitivity to your work, it might mean that you can't help your child like in the middle of the day when he or she wants lunch. But if you don't have a time sensitive, you might be more inclined to like it because you can help your child out and care for them while also doing your work in the free time.
Okay, and there's one more question about the other 2 are discussions, but the question is, so is COVID introducing new trends or is it accelerating movements already in motion? Work from home, design of commercial real estate, online shopping. I think, Brian, if you want to talk about that for like small and big businesses, you were talking about it.
Yeah, so I did mention this a little bit, and that's kind of why I wanted to address the trends that were being seen even before COVID. Because like I said, obviously COVID presented some trends on its own, which is, like the demand for curbside pickup, which probably wouldn't have been a trend or as much of a trend before COVID. But then there were also some ideas that were, like you mentioned, being exacerbated, which was kind of this shift towards a conglomeration and consolidation for the bigger companies, as well as smaller companies losing market share. So yeah, I mean, I think the most appropriate way to answer your question is to say both, because again, there were new trends that weren't foreseen simply because how could you predict COVID? But then at the end of the day, COVID also sped up certain existing trends.
Yeah, I think that's okay. That's all we have time for, really.
I think we have time. We have time for 1 more, 2 more questions. If nobody has one more, I can ask.
There is one. There's a point here. There's an enormous body of research that the economy influences a host of personal decisions. Do I get married? Should we have children? Should we move? Should I invest in a long-term project? What's the longer-term implication of COVID on these choices, and how will they surface in an economy over time? How should we measure? Does it depend on the severity and duration of the pandemic? What opportunities does it present? So I think that's a very broad question. And there's a lot of things that, trends that change, cultural things that happen, mostly that we're just like adjusting to now. and all this uncertainty is like kind of breeding ground for innovation and big decisions, a lot of opportunities that and implications that could happen from it. So like real estate prices towards the middle of the country are cheaper, so you could ideally live somewhere that you don't have to spend as much and still get paid the same amount as you were living like a Silicon Valley place. I mean, that's the whole argument now that people want to change prices for your work, since you're living somewhere wherever you want, and it might be cheaper to live there. But all these implications inform your decisions, and like all these, I guess, like the ramifications of COVID and really do affect like what long-term decisions you make.
Yeah, going off of that, I think the big like decisions such as like should we move or should we invest in a long-term project, I think that's very dependent on interest rates at the time, because you're going to be taking a loan out, and if there's uncertainty, it's going to change the interest rate. So I think that future group, like other groups, are going to touch on that, and that might answer your question a little better.
Yeah, I think ultimately,
I was going to say, building on what you're saying, for a lot of these decisions, it makes a huge difference if these are decisions that have to be made immediately, or if these are decisions you can pause, reflect. And it's hard right now because I think we've reached the point where we've realized as a society, we can live with COVID, we can deal with it. It's not going to completely overwhelm us. How bad the damage is, that's still under debate. When it is hitting in the beginning, same thing during the Great Recession, there is a huge fear that we need to do something big now. And there's often not time to really think everything through. So you had mentioned a lot of the stimulus stuff, where there was one, I think, lone congressman who was clamoring that there are some issues with what's being done. This is being rushed through. And one of the big points that he mentioned was you're actually going to be paying people more money not to work than they were making in their jobs. And nobody listened to him. You know, we got to get it done. We got to get it done. We got to get it done. And you know, sometimes you are in a situation where you have to move quickly. Other times you're in situations where you have to compromise. I was on a call as a school committee member with one of our state reps who was lamenting the gridlock in Washington. And I was saying, I would love to have a clean bill just on school funding that could have bipartisan support. But one of the things you need to recognize about our system is, well, you want something, I want something, let's put it together, and now we assemble a bill that has more supporters. And these are just things to think about going forward as to how do we get to a point where we can actually implement decisions. So I want to thank you all again for a great conversation. And then we will have our next remote presentation on Wednesday. Have a great day.